The wind in 1887 had teeth, and it was chewing on the high desert of the New Mexico territory. It screamed down from the Sangre de Cristos, carrying fine grit that stung the skin and clouded the air in Juniper Crossing, a town that was less a destination and more a scar on the land. The wind found the loose hinge on the sign for the Silver Kettle Eatery and worried it, making a high, metallic shriek that set a man's nerves on edge. Inside the Silver Kettle, the air was thick with the smell of old grease, boiled coffee, and the faint, sour tang of desperation. Lamplight, yellow and weak, cut through the haze of tobacco smoke, illuminating tables sticky with spilled whiskey and syrup. In the farthest corner, away from the door, sat Marin Ashby. She was pretending to read a 2-week-old copy of the Territorial Enterprise, but the paper was just a shield. Her cloak, once a respectable navy blue, had been bleached by 100 suns to the color of dust and hung loosely on her thin frame. Her hair, a deep brown that should have been soft, was baked by that same sun, brittle and streaked with the lighter shades. She looked like a bird that had been caught in a storm too long, feathers ruffled, energy spent, but with an unbroken stillness. A group of prospectors, loud with cheap rye, pushed back from the table near hers, their chairs scraping the floorboards. They left behind a mess of plates, bones, and half-eaten food. Marin waited. She counted to 50, her heart a dry knot in her chest. The proprietor was in the back, arguing with the cook. The wind shrieked. No one was looking. Her stomach, which had been a hollow ache for 2 days, cramped into a fist of true, sharp hunger. Pride was a luxury for those with a full belly. Her hand, chapped and trembling slightly, darted from beneath the newspaper. It was quick, precise. Her fingers closed around a piece of meat pie, the crust thick and greasy, left on a plate. She brought it to her mouth beneath the shadow of the paper, chewing quickly, mechanically. The fat was cold, congealing. It tasted like ash and failure. She was reaching for a second piece, a hard triangle of fried bread, when a shadow fell across her table. She froze. Her eyes snapped up, hard and defensive, ready for the insult, the pity, or the violence. Nolan Prescott stood there. He was a big man, filling the space. His duster was worn, stained with the alkali dust and cow blood of Pronghorn Flats. The angles of his face looked carved from sandstone, weathered by sun and isolation. He looked at her, then at the plate of scraps, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, showed nothing. No pity, no disgust, just observation. He didn't speak to her. He reached down, grabbed the chair from the prospector's abandoned table, and slid it across the floor. The sound was loud in the sudden quiet of the diner. He placed it at his own table, a small two-top near the center of the room. Then he looked back at her. He nodded toward the seat. "Sit with me." His voice was low, rough, like stones dragging in a dry riverbed. It wasn't a request. It was a statement. Marin's first instinct was to run. This was a trap. Men like him, men who looked like they owned the ground they stood on, didn't offer charity without a price. But the wind howled outside, and Hollister's men were in town, and the piece of cold pie was a rock in her gut. She looked at his hands. They were huge, scarred, the knuckles busted, but they were resting steady on the table. Slowly, she stood. She left the newspaper but clutched the thin, worn leather satchel at her side. She walked the 10 feet to his table, her back straight, her chin high, feeling every eye in the room on her. She sat in the chair he had pulled out. Nolan didn't look at her again, not right away. He raised 2 fingers to the proprietor, who had emerged from the back. "Steak," Nolan said. "2, rare as you can make it without it running off the plate, and a full pot of coffee, black." He turned his attention to the salt shaker, meticulously centering it. The silence stretched, pulled thin and tight as a banjo string. Marin gripped her satchel in her lap. She was a coiled spring, ready to bolt. He was calm, a granite boulder settled in the earth. He seemed to draw the quiet around him, a man so used to his own company that he wore solitude like a second coat. Across the street, the saloon doors swung open, spilling the sound of an off-key piano into the night. The tune was jagged, stumbling over itself, a mockery of cheer. Marin watched as 3 men stepped onto the boardwalk opposite, even through the grimy window. She recognized the cut of their coats, the silver conchos, the way they moved as a pack. Pike Hollister's men? They scanned the street, their eyes sweeping doorways and windows, looking for something, looking for someone. Marin's breath hitched. She forced herself to look away. Back at the table, at the wood grain, at the man opposite her. The food arrived. 2 heavy plates, the meat dark, the juice pooling, a pot of coffee that smelled sharp and burnt. Nolan slid 1 plate in front of her. He poured her a cup of coffee, then his own. He picked up his knife and fork. "Eat," he said. Marin picked up her fork. Her hands were shaking. The first cut was clumsy. She brought the meat to her mouth. It was hot, metallic, and overwhelmingly real. The warmth spread through her, fighting back the cold that had lived in her bones for weeks. She closed her eyes for just a second, a silent admission of defeat and gratitude. She ate slowly, forcing herself, refusing to devour the food like an animal. Nolan ate with a steady, unhurried rhythm. He didn't try to make conversation. He didn't ask her name, or where she came from, or why a woman with eyes that sharp was eating another man's leavings. He just drank his coffee and ate his steak, offering a quiet, solid presence that was more disarming than any questions would have been. Marin felt a single, dangerous tear threaten to form. She blinked it back, furious. Tears were weakness. Weakness got you killed. She was halfway through the steak, the warmth making her drowsy and dulling her edge, when she reached for her coffee cup. Her sleeve, damp from the alley mist, caught the edge of her leather satchel. She tried to catch it, but it slipped from her lap, landing on the floorboards with a soft, dull thud. Before she could move, Nolan had bent down. His large hand scooped it up. It was a small, thin ledger book, bound in scarred brown leather, held shut with a simple tie. He didn't mean to pry, but as he lifted it, the cover flopped open. He was a rancher, not a clerk, but he was a man who understood numbers. He saw columns, precise and tight, but they weren't dollars and cents. They were symbols, strange accounting marks, like a private code, and at the bottom of the page, visible for half a second in the lamplight, was an embossed stamp. He saw it clearly, a stylized C and W linked by a railroad spike, Crane Western Rail. His face registered nothing, but a new stillness settled over him. He handed the book back to her, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was rough as cured leather, but warm. Marin snatched the book, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tucked it away, her eyes flashing, daring him to speak. He just took another sip of coffee, but the moment was broken. The spell of the quiet meal was gone. Outside, one of Hollister's men had crossed the street. He was a wiry man with a face like a weasel. He stopped, cupped his hands to the glass of the silver kettle, and peered inside. His eyes scanned the room, passed over Nolan, and then landed on Marin. His predatory gaze locked onto hers. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. He saw her. He tapped the glass twice with his knuckle, a sound like a woodpecker on a coffin, and pointed right at her. Nolan saw the man's reflection in the glass behind Marin's head. He didn't turn, he didn't panic. In one smooth motion, he leaned forward, his body shielding her from the window. His voice was a low rumble, cutting through her panic. "If you want to leave here whole, I have a horse in the alley." He dropped $2 silver on the table, more than enough to cover the meal. He was already standing, grabbing her arm, not violently, but with an undeniable, non-negotiable grip. "Through the kitchen, now!" He didn't lead her. He propelled her. They burst through the swinging doors into the back. The cook yelled in surprise as they passed. The air was suffocating, thick with the acrid smell of burning coffee beans and boiled cabbage. Nolan shoved open the back door, and the cold night air hit them like a slap. The alley was a canyon of darkness. smelling of frozen mud and stale beer. A single, solid gray horse was tethered to a drain pipe, its breath pluming in the dark. It wasn't a flashy animal. It was built for endurance. From the front of the diner, they heard a shout and the crash of a chair. "This way!" Marin hesitated. For half a second, the terror of Hollister's men warred with a lifetime of trusting no one. This stranger, this alley, this horse. Nolan didn't give her time for a full second. He grabbed her waist with one arm, lifting her bodily, and swung her onto the saddle. He untied the rein, put a boot in the stirrup, and mounted behind her, his large frame pressing her forward, shielding her completely. He wheeled the horse in the narrow space. "Hold on," he commanded. Marin didn't need to be told. She grabbed a fistful of the horse's mane and the thick horn of the saddle. She felt his arm go around her waist, holding her secure against his chest. They exploded from the alley, hooves striking sparks on the frozen stones. They hit the main street not toward the lights, but away, plunging into the vast, black emptiness of the prairie that began where the town's last shack ended. They rode hard for a mile, the only sound the rhythmic pounding of the horses' hooves and the whistle of the wind in their ears. Behind them, Juniper Crossing was just a smear of yellow light, already swallowed by the dark. And then, carried on the wind, came another sound, distant, mournful, and relentless. It was the whistle of the night train, the one laying track for the Crane Western Rail. It sounded less like a promise of progress and more like a warning, a mechanical howl echoing the omen of the wind. Marin Ashby shivered and leaned back, just slightly, into the solid, silent warmth of the man who had just saved her life. The ride was silent, a black void punctuated by the rhythmic labor of the horse. Nolan didn't push the animal. He let it find its footing in the dark, moving across the high, cold desert with a familiarity that spoke of years. Marin held fast against him, felt the landscape change. The open plain gave way to the sharp, peppery scent of mesquite, and then to the looming shadows of low hills. The wind was different here, channeled by arroyos, quieter but colder. Pronghorn Flats was not a town. It was a statement of solitude. They topped a final rise, and Marin saw it below a single cabin, a large, well-built barn, and a series of corrals, stark and dark against the immense, star-dusted sky. There were no other lights for 50 miles in any direction. The isolation was absolute. It was either a sanctuary or a tomb. Nolan reined the horse into the barn. The air inside was warm, smelling of hay, horsehide, and the sweet, sour tang of manure. He dismounted in one fluid motion, then turned and offered his hands to her. Marin hesitated. Taking his hands to dismount felt like an acceptance, a form of surrender, but her legs were numb, frozen blocks from the ride. She put her hands in his. His grip was firm, impersonal. He lowered her to the ground as if she were a sack of feed, his strength effortless. He didn't release her until her feet were steady on the dirt floor. "He'll need rubbing down," Nolan said, already reaching for a burlap sack. "I can," Marin offered, her voice stiff. Nolan paused, looking at her in the gloom. "No, you're cold. Go inside. The door's not barred. Stove is cold. But the kindling's in the box." He turned back to the horse, his movements economical and precise. He was already a part of the animal's world, leaving her to face the human one. She crossed the hard-packed yard. The wind tried to snatch her cloak. The cabin door was thick, solid wood. It opened on a single room, dark and still. She found a lucifer match on the mantel, struck it, and lit the kerosene lamp on the table. The light bloomed, revealing his life. It was a room of stark, masculine utility. A cast-iron stove, a dry sink, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a single bunk built into the wall, a larger bed in the far corner. There was a shelf of books, a Bible, Shakespeare, and several thick volumes on animal husbandry. The floor was swept clean. A Winchester rifle was mounted over the fireplace, and another leaned by the door, ready. It was the cleanest, most desolate room she had ever seen. Nolan entered, carrying her small satchel, which she hadn't even realized she'd left on the horse. He closed the door, and the sound of the latch sliding home seemed to sever the last tie to the outside world. "The bunk is yours," he said, not looking at her. He dropped her satchel onto it. "The blankets are clean." He moved to the stove, his large frame filling the small space. He laid the kindling with practiced hands, added split pine, and soon a small, hungry fire was crackling. The promise of heat was almost more comforting than the steak had been. Marin stood by the door, a sentinel. She watched him. He moved like a man who never expected help and never offered excuses. "You're tracking mud," he said, nodding to her feet. She looked down. Her boots were caked with the alley's filth, but she didn't move to take them off. A person who took off their boots was planning on staying. A person who took off their boots could be caught. Instead, she unclasped her cloak and hung it on a peg by the door. She moved to the bunk, sat on the edge, her back rigid. Nolan poured water from a bucket into the coffee pot and set it on the stove. The silence returned, filled only by the crackle of the wood and the rising moan of the wind. When the coffee was hot, he poured 2 tin cups, set one on the table, and motioned for her to take it. She did. She held the hot metal in her hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. But she didn't drink. "Hollister," Nolan said, not a question. Marin nodded, her eyes on the steam rising from the cup. "He's a hired gun, works for the highest bidder. Lately, that's been Silas Crane." He said the name, and the air in the cabin turned sharp. Marin's grip on the cup tightened. "You saw the book," she said, her voice flat. "Crane Western Rail. They've been buying up water rights south of here, pushing ranchers out." "They aren't buying," Marin said, the words tasting like acid. "They're stealing." She finally looked at him, her eyes burning in her pale, exhausted face. "I was his clerk, in the Santa Fe office. I handled the ledgers, the real ones, and the ones he kept for the territory inspectors." She took a ragged breath. "He's a thief, Mr. Prescott. He's grabbing land, grazing land, farmsteads, anything in the path of his new spur line. He uses forged surveys, pays off judges. He files false claims on abandoned homesteads, then buys the land for pennies from the Territory Land Office. It's all paper and ink, but it's as much a theft as a gun to the head." Nolan watched her, his expression unreadable. He had seen men like Crane, men who used laws like a club to beat smaller men down. Marin set her cup down and reached for her satchel. She pulled out the thin leather ledger. "This isn't his book. It's mine. A cross-reference." She opened it. The pages were dense with her neat, coded script. He paid Judge Matheson $500 for the Saguaro Valley ruling. He paid the land assessor in whiskey and stock options to lose the original survey maps for the Double T Ranch. It's all in here. Dates, amounts, names. She ran a finger over a line of symbols. "This is my own shorthand. He can claim his books were a mistake." "But I was there. I took these notes. I can attest to every entry." She looked up at him, her defiance a thin, brittle shield. "That's why Hollister is here. I'm not just a clerk who ran. I'm the one who took the proof." Nolan was silent for a long time. He walked to the window, pushed the curtain aside, and stared out into the blackness. The fire snapped. "You're a dangerous woman to be around, Miss Ashby." "I know." He let the curtain fall. He turned, and his gaze was heavy. "People in Juniper Crossing? They have stories about this place, about me." He picked up his own coffee cup, his large hand swallowing it. "They say I'm bad luck, cursed." He didn't say it with self-pity, but with a flat, worn acceptance. "I had a fiancée, Eliza, years ago. We were building this place together. There was a flash flood. Up in the high pasture, she went after a dozen head of stray cattle, stubborn. She thought she knew the land better than the water." His voice went quiet. "She didn't." "They found the wagon 2 miles down the arroyo. They never found her." He looked into his coffee cup as if seeing the memory there. "After that, the drought came, then a cattle fever. People started to whisper. Pronghorn Flats is a cursed place. Nolan Prescott carries a shadow. After a while, a man stops arguing. I found I prefer the company of cattle. They don't talk, and they don't lie. He looked at her. I'm telling you this so you know. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who's already been left alone. Crane's men, they don't scare me much, but you should know what kind of sanctuary you found. Before Marin could answer, a new light flickered at the edge of the window curtain. Not the lamp. It was a faint, unnatural orange, pulsing against the hills to the east, toward town. Nolan was at the window in 2 strides. He cursed, low and soft. What is it? Marin was at his side. He pointed. That's the Miller place, a small farmstead. Hollister, he's setting fires. Creating a diversion, trying to pull the law, what little there is, out of town so he can search without interference. The sight of the distant, malicious fire chilled Marin more than the ride had. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a war. Nolan turned from the window. His face was set. You can stay, he said, as long as you need. I've got feed to haul tomorrow, and those cows don't care about Silas Crane. He nodded toward the bunk. Get some sleep. I won't ask any more questions until you want to tell the answers. Marin looked into his eyes. She had spent her life reading men's faces for lies, for weakness, for intent. In Nolan's, she saw something she had never encountered, an absolute, unjudging silence, a stillness that matched the land itself. She nodded. She went to the bunk. She would not sleep. She would rest her eyes. She laid her head on the thin pillow. She slipped the small, sharp knife from her boot and slid it under the pillow, her hand resting on the hilt. She did not take off her boots. An hour passed. The fire in the stove burned down to embers. The cabin grew cold. Nolan sat in his chair, not sleeping, just watching the dying glow. Then he stiffened. Marin was awake instantly. What? She whispered. He didn't answer. He was listening. Then she heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of a shod horse stepping on gravel. And another, not his horses, which were in the barn. These were in the yard. Nolan moved with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He didn't rush. He simply crossed the room, turned down the lamp wick, and with a soft puff, blew it out. The room was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Marin's heart was a drum against her ribs. The only light was the faint, dying red of the stove's grate. The cabin was suddenly filled with new smells, the hot, metallic scent of the extinguished wick, the dusty smell of pine, and the sharp, clean odor of gun oil. Nolan was a shadow moving against shadows. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice, and pulled her off the bunk. He didn't pull her toward him. He pushed her down, into the darkest corner of the room, between the cold fireplace and the wall. He crouched in front of her, a solid wall of darkness. She heard the soft, metallic shing of the Winchester being lifted from its pegs. Stay still, he breathed. The words were a vibration in the air, not a sound. Outside, a man cleared his throat. A shadow passed the window. Then another. They were moving around the house, checking the barn. He's in there, a low, gravelly voice said. It was close, right outside the door. I smelled the smoke. He's not alone. Marin's blood turned to ice. It was Hollister. Pike just wants the girl. Another voice, younger, whined. And the book. Let's just go in. She's in there, Hollister's voice repeated. Closer now, at the window. Crane's girl, I can smell the fear. Marin's back was pressed so hard against the log wall she could feel the rough bark through her clothes. Her hand was on the knife beneath her pillow, but the pillow was on the bunk. 10 feet away, she was defenseless. Nolan raised the Winchester. She could see the faint outline of the barrel in the moonlight filtering through the window's gap. He was steady as a rock. He could shoot Hollister through the wall, but he didn't. He waited. Firing now would mean a firefight. It would reveal their exact location. It would mean war. Here, in his home. The shadows outside conferred. Maybe they rode on, the younger voice said. No, Hollister said. The horse in the barn is hot. They're here. We'll wait for sunup. Or we'll burn them out, just like the Miller place. The footsteps receded. The shadows moved away from the house, toward the barn, likely to take up positions. The immediate danger had passed, but the threat was now a siege. In the dark corner, Nolan slowly, silently, lowered the rifle. He didn't move from his position in front of Marin. She was still trapped, still breathing the scent of his coat. He turned his head. She couldn't see his face, only the outline of his head against the slightly less dark window. She could feel the tension radiating from him, a controlled, simmering energy. He had not run. He had not offered her to them. He had hidden her. He had protected her. He had made her problem his own. She couldn't speak. She didn't need to. In the faint, cold moonlight, she saw him nod, just once, a sharp, definitive gesture. Marin Ashby nodded back. It was a pact, sealed in the dark, with no words, only the shared understanding of a common enemy. From this moment, they were no longer a rancher and a refugee. They were allies. Hollister's men were gone with the daylight. The siege had been a test, a probing of defenses, and they had withdrawn, leaving only the cold, sharp imprint of their presence. The sunrise was a brutal, bruised purple, flooding the high desert with a light that offered no warmth, only visibility. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the dust of old hay and the animal warmth of the horses. Nolan ran a hand down the frayed leather of a bridle strap, his large fingers clumsy in the intricate work of prying the old stitching loose. He was a man who could build a fence from rock and wire, who could break a wild horse, but the delicate work of a needle and awl frustrated him. He grunted, the sinew thread slipping from his grasp. Marin, who had been watching from the stall doorway, stepped forward. She said nothing. She simply held out her hand. He looked at her hand, small, chapped, the knuckles red from cold. Then he looked at his own, a scarred, rough map of a hard life. He passed her the broken tack, the needle, and the sticky coil of sinew. She sat on a three-legged milking stool, settled the leather in her lap, and went to work. Her movements were not his. They were economical, precise, and certain. Her fingers, which he'd seen tremble as they stole food, were now steady as a surgeon's. She pushed the needle through the tough leather, her brow furrowed in concentration. The purple dawnlight caught the film of harness oil on her fingers, making them glint. "My father was a miner," she said, her voice quiet, not meant to break the silence, but to fill it. "He taught me to mend his gear, a broken strap, a loose buckle. In his work, it could mean a life." Nolan watched the needle's precise in and out. He had pegged her for a city woman, a clerk, but these hands knew a different kind of labor. "Your father taught you well." "He taught me that the things you trust have to be whole," she said, pulling the stitch tight with a sharp, practiced twist of her wrist. She finished the line, knotted it, and handed the bridle back to him. It was stronger than it had been when it was new. He took it from her. Their fingers didn't touch, but the warmth of her hands was still on the leather. Back in the cabin, the morning chill had invaded the room, leaving the air stale with the smell of old fear and burnt kerosene. Nolan went to the stove first, his movements stiff. He didn't build a fire for warmth. He built it for food. He filled the heavy pot with beans, added a thick slice of salt pork, and hung it over the flames. Marin stood by the window, a sentinel, watching the empty ridges. They were not empty. They were just waiting. When the beans were thick and hot, the smell of smoke and salt filling the cabin, Nolan ladled a steaming portion into a tin bowl. He hunted for a second spoon, found only one. It was wooden, the bowl stained dark from 1,000 meals, the handle worn smooth and thin, molded to the shape of his hand. He gave it to her. She took the bowl. It was hot, almost too hot to hold. She took the spoon. The wood was smooth, personal. She sat at the table, wrapped her cold hands around the bowl, and let the heat seep into her palms. It moved up her arms, a slow, crawling warmth that reached a knot of ice she had been carrying between her shoulder blades for weeks. She took a bite. It was simple food. It was salt and substance. It was the first meal she had eaten in longer than she could remember that was not stolen or offered in pity. It was shared. She felt her shoulders, which had been drawn up to her ears in a permanent, defensive crouch, slowly, painfully, begin to unclench. She kept her head bowed over the bowl, the steam hiding the sudden, treacherous sting in her eyes. Nolan ate his own portion standing by the stove, his back to her, watching the land through the window. The day stretched, a taut wire of suspense. They were a visible target. "He'll be back," Nolan said, his voice flat as he methodically oiled the Winchester he hadn't fired. "Or he'll send others. This is just the start." "He's watching," Marin said, gesturing to the ridges. "He knows we're here. He's just waiting." "Then we make rules," Nolan said. He was a man of systems, of fences and boundaries. "I have to check the North Spring. The cattle won't wait. You'll stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone." "How will I know it's you?" Her voice was practical, sharp. He paused. "I'll whistle. A quail call. 3 notes. Then a pause. Then 1. He whistled it. It was a complex, specific rhythm, a personal signature on the air. "Don't answer unless you hear that. And at night," he said, touching the lamp on the table. "If you're here and I'm in the barn." 1 flash from the window. That means all is well. 2 flashes, close together. That means danger. That means you stay hidden or you run. I'll do the same from the barn. They were 2 strategists, laying plans for a war in a territory of 2. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence of the cabin was too loud. They had to fill it. Marin pulled out her thin ledger. "If they get me," she said, the words blunt. "This is useless to you. It's just scribbles." She sat at the table, and he pulled up the other chair. She pointed to her code. "This mark, the crossed T, that's Judge Matheson. This swirl, that's a cash payment. This square with the line, Saguaro Valley." He hunched over the book, his large, rough finger tracing the precise lines she had drawn. He was slow, but methodical. He was learning her language. "So, this entry," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It means Crane paid Matheson cash, and gave him the deed to the Rock Creek parcel." "Yes," Marin said, impressed. "To hold as collateral. It's a bribe, filed as a land deal. It's how he makes it look legal." Nolan's face was grim. The anger in his eyes was a cold, blue fire. This was his land, his world, being stolen by men with soft hands and fountain pens. Later, he took her out behind the barn, to the north side, shielded by a high drift of rock. He pushed the Winchester into her hands. The metal was cold, the wood heavy. "You need to know how to use this," he said. "Not just how to hold it, how to make it a part in your hand." "I've fired a gun." "Not this one." He showed her how to break it down. His movements economical. The parts clicked and slid apart in his hands, revealing the oiled, precise inner workings. "This is a machine. You have to know the machine." Her clerk's hands, so adept with a needle, fumbled with the heavy steel. But she learned. She learned the feel of the lever, the smell of the gun oil, the weight of the mechanism. "Now load it," he said. He tossed her a handful of brass cartridges. They felt heavy, deadly. She tried to feed them into the gate. They jammed. Her fingers were cold and clumsy. "No," he said, his voice impatient but not unkind. "Not like that. You're fighting it. Let it take them." He took the rifle from her. His hands, which had been so clumsy with the thread, were now a blur of graceful, terrifying efficiency. The shells disappeared into the rifle with a series of smooth, oiled clicks. "Like silk," he said, his voice low. "No wasted motion. Your life is in the motion. Try again." She did, again and again, until her fingers were raw and the steel felt like a part of her arm, and the click-clack of the loading gate was a rhythm she could feel in her bones. In the late afternoon, they stood on the porch, a brief, armed truce with the day. They were scanning the horizon, a habit that was now as natural as breathing. A flicker of movement in the distance, too fluid for riders. "Look," Nolan breathed, his hand gripping the porch rail. A band of wild horses, a dozen strong, poured over the far ridge. They moved like smoke, a single, flowing entity of horseflesh and dust. At their head, a magnificent roan stallion, his coat the color of strawberries and mist, his mane and tail like white fire. "Ghost wind," Nolan said, the word holding a rare reverence. "He's been running that herd for 5 years. No one can lay a rope on him. They say he's part spirit." The horses paused, a mile distant, scenting the air. They saw the ranch, the two figures standing still. Then, as one, the stallion wheeled, and the herd vanished, melting back into the arroyos and canyons as if they had never been. Marin was standing, her hand gripping the rails so hard her knuckles were white, and she was smiling. It was not the grimace of irony she'd worn in the diner. It was a small, genuine upward curve of her lips. It transformed her face, wiping away the exhaustion and the fear, revealing a glimpse of the woman who had existed before the ledgers and the running. "He's beautiful," she whispered. Nolan found himself staring at her smile, not the empty ridge where the horses had been. It was a rarer, more fragile, and far more dangerous sight than the stallion. The wind shifted, carrying the first false hint of summer. It was dry, sharp, and clean, heavy with the scent of sun-baked sagebrush. They were in the barn, checking the last of the grain sacks, ensuring Hollister hadn't poisoned the feed. Marin leaned deep over a barrel to scoop a handful of oats from the bottom, testing for mold. Nolan stood beside her, doing the same. As she straightened, she was closer to him than she had realized. The wind, puffing through the open barn door, caught the loose end of the blue cotton neckerchief she wore. The cloth, light as a sigh, drifted, brushing against the back of Nolan's wrist. It was nothing, a thread of cotton on calloused skin. Nolan's heart gave a single, hard, painful thump against his ribs. His breath hitched. He was suddenly, overwhelmingly aware of her. The clean, sharp scent of her hair, the curve of her neck, the small space she occupied in his massive, empty world. He stepped back. It was only half a step, but it was a chasm. He turned away, his face set. He was terrified, not of Hollister, not of Crane. He was terrified of this feeling. This was the bad luck. This was the shadow. He had let Eliza get close, and the land had taken her. He would not let his curse find a new target. He would not be the reason for her death. The small, shared moment, and his stark retreat, broke something open in Marin. The wall of silence was cracked. That night, they sat in the cabin. The fire was low. The silence was heavy, filled with the things they hadn't said. "He died because of them," Marin said, her voice a low, flat thing in the quiet. Nolan stopped, a log in his hand. He turned. "Who?" "My father, the miner." She was staring into the flames, her hands clasped so tightly they were white. It wasn't a simple accident. The company, a different name, but the same men as Crane. They were cutting corners. The shoring beams in the new tunnel were green wood, rotten, they knew. My father, he kept his own notes. She traced the grain of the wood on the table. He was going to report them to the territorial inspector. The night before the meeting, there was a cave-in, just his section, just him. She looked up at Nolan, and her eyes were not filled with tears. They were burning. They killed him with a rotten beam and a false report. Crane is killing these ranchers with a judge's seal and a forged map. It's the same thing. It's theft. It's murder. Just slower. I hate them. I hate the way they smile and talk about progress while they're burying people. Nolan put the log in the firebox, his movements deliberate. He walked across the room and stood in front of her. He didn't sit. He was a mountain of quiet, solid shadow. He looked at her for a long time, longer than a simple breath. He saw the grief. He saw the rage, and he saw the impossible. Stupid, beautiful steel that had kept her alive. He spoke, and his voice was not a comfort. It was a vow. "I won't let them touch you." The words were simple. They were not "it will be fine" or "we will win." They were a barrier, a lock, a piece of iron. He was placing himself, his cursed, solitary life, between her and all of them. Marin held his gaze. The fear, the cold companion that had slept with her for months, did not vanish. But for the first time, it had to move over. He was still standing there, the promise hanging like a shield in the small room, when a movement on the far ridge caught his eye. He was at the window in 2 strides. "Riders!" Marin was at his side. It wasn't Hollister's pack of wolves. This was different. 4 riders, moving at a walk, as if they owned the land. They wore badges. "Town," Nolan said, his voice flat. At the lead was a portly man in a clean suit, his face self-important. Deacon Voss. "Voss," Marin whispered, the name a curse on her lips. "He's Crane's puppet. He signs the papers. He's the polite face of the theft." The riders were not passing by. They were heading straight for the cabin. The time for mending tack and learning codes, the brief, stolen peace, was over. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was riding into his yard. Deacon Voss did not stop at the cabin. He reined in his horse 20 yards from the porch, his 3 deputies fanning out, their hands resting on their pistol grips. Nolan stepped onto the porch, his Winchester held loosely at his side, barrel down. Marin stood in the shadow of the doorway, just out of sight. Voss was a man who looked soft but whose eyes were like chips of flint. He smiled, a thin, greasy expression. "Prescott, just a friendly patrol. Heard you had company." "The land's not posted," Nolan said, his voice flat. No, it ain't," Voss agreed, patting his horse's neck. "But some company is more trouble than it's worth. Silas Crane is a benefactor to this territory. He doesn't take kindly to complications." "Is that a threat?" "Deacon?" Voss's smile widened, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "That's advice. Just advice." He looked past Nolan, trying to pierce the shadow in the doorway. "You tell your complication that Mr. Hollister is a man who finishes his business." He wheeled his horse, his deputies moving with him. They rode away at the same self-important walk, stirring up dust that settled back onto the hard, dry land. The moment they were gone, the truce of waiting was broken. They were no longer prey. They had to become predators. "He just confirmed it," Marin said, stepping into the sun, her voice shaking with a cold rage. "They're all in it. The law, the guns, the money. They're all one animal." "Then we stop waiting for it to bite," Nolan said. He looked at his ranch, his home, not as a sanctuary, but as a battlefield. "We set our own teeth." The next 3 days were a blur of frantic, silent labor. They moved with the grim efficiency of soldiers preparing for a siege, the unspoken fear of the coming fight hanging between them. They turned Pronghorn Flats into a trap. Nolan, with his rancher's knowledge of the land, took the lead. He led Marin up the dry, winding trail that served as the only real approach to the cabin. "Hollister's lazy," he said, kicking a stone. "He'll come the easy way." He sunk a heavy iron post into the rock, hidden by a clump of rabbit brush. From it, he strung a thin tripwire, nearly invisible, leading it 50 yards down to the barn. He tied the end to a string of dented cowbells, muffled with scraps of burlap. "It won't stop them," he grunted. "But it'll tell us they're here. Sound travels funny in these canyons. This will be the only truth." Marin, smaller and lighter, shimmied up a tall, skeletal pine that overlooked the trail. Using twine, she affixed a small, cracked piece of her own looking-glass to a branch, angling it precisely. "What's this for?" she called down. "Sun," he replied, pointing. "In the morning, it'll catch the sun. In the afternoon, it'll reflect the light from the cabin window. But at night, if they come with lanterns, it'll flash. It's a second set of eyes." They dug a shallow pit on a blind corner, covering it with brittle brush and a dusting of dirt. It wasn't deep enough to kill a horse, but it was deep enough to break its leg. It was a cruel, ugly piece of work, and they both hated it. While Nolan worked outside, reinforcing the barn door and calculating angles of fire, Maren worked inside. The cabin became her new office. She couldn't fight them with a gun. Not yet. So she would fight them with her ink. She took the last of Nolan's lamp oil, a small roll of butcher's paper he used for wrapping cured meat, and a stick of charcoal from the fire. She began to copy the ledger. It was painstaking, agonizing work. Her coded symbols had to be perfect. A slip of the charcoal, a smudge of oil, and the entry was worthless. She worked until her fingers cramped and her back was a knot of fire. She created 2 complete copies. The cabin was silent save for the scrape of charcoal on the rough paper and the heavy, ticking presence of the clock. When she was done, she had 3 books, the original, and 2 ghosts. "One for us, one to hide, one to send," she said to Nolan, her voice raw with exhaustion. He watched her. She was thinner than when she arrived. The skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, but her eyes were harder, brighter. "Where do we hide the real one?" he asked, trusting her judgment in this. She looked around the small cabin. Hollister's men would tear it apart. They would look in the flour bin, under the mattress, in the chimney. They would look for a hiding place. She walked to the front door. She stomped on the floorboard just inside the threshold. It gave a hollow, off-key thwack. It was warped, the nail loose. "Here," she said. Nolan looked at her. "That's the first place they'll step." "Exactly," she said. "It's not a hiding place. It's just a bad floorboard." With his heavy pry bar, he lifted the plank. The space beneath was shallow, filled with dust and spiders. Maren wrapped the original ledger in a piece of oilcloth, tied it with sinew, and laid it in the dirt. Nolan hammered the plank back down. It still made the same sound. The most important secret in the territory was now hidden by the sound of a simple, overlooked flaw. They had to get the copies out. They were trapped, but the book could not be. Nolan rode out at 3 a.m, under a sliver of moon. He took the long way into Juniper Crossing, coming in from the south like a man just checking his traps. He went not to the saloon, but to the small, clapboard office of Doc Harlan Mott. Mott was a man in his 60s, his face a roadmap of whiskey and wisdom. He was the only man in town who had ever stood up to Deacon Voss, and he was the only man Nolan Prescott trusted. Mott let Nolan in the back door. He was in his undershirt, cleaning a scalpel. "You're either dying or you're in a hell of a hurry. Nolan." "Which is it?" "Both, maybe," Nolan said. He laid one of the wrapped copies on the table. Among the laudanum bottles and suture needles, "This is proof. Silas Crane's theft, all written down." Doc Mott didn't touch it. He just looked at Nolan. "Is it the girl the one Hollister's hunting?" "It is. And she's at your place." It wasn't a question. "She is." Mott sighed. A long, rattling sound. He picked up the packet. "This is plague, son. You know that. You're bringing the plague to my door." "I am," Nolan said. "Damn you," Mott said. But there was no heat in it. He walked to his tall anatomy cabinet, unlocked it, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book, Gray's Anatomy. He opened it to the center, where the pages depicting the human heart had been carefully hollowed out. He placed Maren's book inside. "If they ask," Mott said. "I'll sign as a witness. I'll swear to what I've seen. But you know my word against Crane's money. It's just wind. Wind can still spread a fire," Nolan said. Maren, meanwhile, had to see her own contact. She rode Nolan's second horse, a skittish mare, keeping to the arroyos. She didn't go to the town. She went to the back door of the Gold Spur Saloon, the one opposite the Silver Kettle. Lark Monroe was a saloon singer, but she was no one's fool. She had a voice like warm honey and a spine like a bar of steel. She was Maren's oldest friend, the only person she'd trusted in Santa Fe, and the reason she had run to Juniper Crossing in the first place. Maren slipped into the dim, sour-smelling storage room. Lark was there, rubbing rouge onto her cheeks. She saw Maren, and her painted-on smile vanished, replaced by stark fear. "Mary, sweet Jesus, they said you were dead." "Not yet," Maren whispered. thrusting the second copy, wrapped in paper, at her. "Lark, I need you to hide this. Not here. Somewhere safe." Lark's eyes darted around. "Safe, Marin? There's no safe. Hollister's been in here every night. He bought a new coil of rope. He's talking about how he's going to tame you. He's not bringing a coffin. He's bringing a bridle." A cold, sick dread, worse than the fear of death, washed over Marin. She gripped her friend's arm. "Lark, please." Lark looked at the packet, then at the scarred upright piano in the corner of the main room. "Give it here." She walked out, bold as brass, into the empty saloon. She lifted the top lid of the piano, unhooked the prop, and laid the packet deep inside, resting on the thick felt pads beside the hammers. "No one touches this but me," she said. "It'll be safe here, between the G sharp and the A." As Marin slipped out the back, she almost collided with a woman coming around the corner. The woman was tall, wore a man's duster, and had a silver star pinned to it. Deputy Wren Mallory. Wren Mallory had eyes that saw everything and a mouth that said nothing. She was fast with her gun, faster than any man in the territory, which was the only reason Voss kept her. Wren's gaze swept over Marin, taking in the dust, the fear, and the horse hidden in the alley. Her eyes flickered to the saloon's back door, then to the street where one of Hollister's men was watching. Wren's face was a stone mask. For a long, terrible second, the two women just looked at each other. Then, with a deliberation that was almost an act of violence, Wren Mallory turned her head and looked up at the sky. As if checking the weather, she had seen nothing. Marin didn't wait. She ran. The noose was tightening. Lark's news and Wren's calculated blindness fueled the panic. Rumors were flying through town. Silas Crane was coming in on his personal train. The Saguaro Spur Line, the one built on stolen land, was having its grand opening in 2 days. There would be fireworks, free whiskey, and a speech. It was a celebration of their own demise, and the town was preparing for a party. For Hollister, it was a deadline. He had to deliver the clerk for the celebration. The news about the rope, the bridle, it had gotten inside Marin's defenses. "He wants me alive," she whispered to Nolan that night, her voice brittle. "Death is easy. He's carrying rope." Nolan's face, in the dim lamplight, was a terrible thing to see. The cold, quiet stillness was gone, replaced by a dark, simmering rage that made him a stranger. He didn't say anything. He just went to the window and stared out, his hand clenching and unclenching at his side. The night before the grand opening, the sky broke. The dry heat of the past week vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent, electrical storm. Rain didn't fall. It was driven in horizontal sheets by a wind that screamed like a mourner. It was madness to be outside, but they were behind the barn, using the flashes of lightning to see. "Again!" Nolan yelled over the wind. He set up 3 tin cans on the fence rail. Marin raised the Winchester. It was heavy, slick with rain. Her hands were numb. She fired. The shot was lost in a crack of thunder. One can flew off. "You're pulling!" he shouted, his voice close to her ear. He put his hand over hers on the stock, forcing her to feel the rifle's center. "Don't aim. Just look. Feel where it's going. Squeeze. Don't pull." Lightning split the sky, illuminating his face, the rain running in rivers down the hard lines of his cheeks. She looked at him. Not the target. Again, she fired. A second can vanished. Again, she fired. The third can was gone. They stood there, soaked to the bone, the smell of cordite and rain in their nostrils. Every shot they'd fired, every trap they'd set, every secret they'd shared. It had all been a step. They were bound together now, not just by a common enemy, but by a shared, desperate faith. But the wind was changing. The rain stopped, as if a tap had been turned off. The electrical smell was replaced by something else. Dust. A dry, choking, alkali taste. A low, deep rumble, different from the thunder, began to vibrate in the ground. "A duster," Nolan breathed. his head raised. A big one. As if summoned by the storm, a wall of black and red dust, 1,000 feet high, was rolling in from the east. It was a physical, moving mountain of grit, swallowing the world, and riding just ahead of it, like demons surfing the tide of chaos, was a line of riders. Nolan grabbed her arm. "Hollister!" The storm had not been a reprieve, it had been a signal. Lightning flashed one last time, freezing the scene, the wall of black dust, the silhouette of the ranch, and the dozen riders charging forward, a pack of wolves materializing from the throat of the storm. The world ended. It did not end with fire, but with earth. The dust storm hit Pronghorn Flats not as a weather event, but as a physical assault. The wind, which had been screaming, suddenly choked. The air was not air, it was a solid, moving wall of pulverized grit and alkali. In 1 second, the sun vanished. The world was reduced to a roaring, suffocating darkness, lit only by flashes of blue-white static electricity that cracked in the air like a bullwhip. Through the chaos, in a flash of that spectral lightning, Marin saw them. Hollister's men, leaning low over their horses, materializing from the wall of dust, their faces masked by bandanas. "The barn!" Nolan's voice was a raw tear in the noise. He didn't wait for her. He seized her arm, his grip a band of iron, and pulled her from the porch. The grit stung her face, blinding her. She ran because he was pulling her, trusting his weight. They half fell through the barn door. Nolan slammed the heavy plank door shut and dropped the thick iron bar into its brackets. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by a deafening, thunderous roar. The entire barn shuddered, the timbers groaning as if the building itself were about to be ripped from the earth. It was pitch black. Dust forced its way through every crack, filling the air with a taste of dry, ancient stone. "This way!" he yelled, his voice sounding small. He still had her arm, pulling her deeper inside, past the nervous whinnies of his horses, away from the straining door. He shoved her into the deepest, darkest corner, a stall filled with dry, sweet-smelling hay and the scent of old leather from the tack hanging on the walls. They fell into the hay, a tangle of limbs. The noise was overwhelming. It was the sound of the world being scoured clean. Nolan pushed her back against the solid log wall, his body covering hers, shielding her. "We wait for a lull," he breathed, his mouth close to her ear. "We have to get to the old stone foundation by the creek. This barn, it won't hold." Marin nodded, but she couldn't speak. She was pressed against the rough logs, the hay scratching her neck, and Nolan's body was a solid, hot wall in front of her. She could feel his heart. It was not the frantic rabbit thump of her own. It was a slow, heavy, powerful beat. Thump, thump, a rhythm of stone and earth. She realized, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that she was trembling. But it was not from fear. The fear was a cold, distant thing. This was different. This was the immediate, suffocating proximity of him. This was the heat radiating from his chest, the smell of his skin salt, leather, rain, and a faint, clean scent of pine soap. The wind screamed. A sheet of tin roofing was ripped from the barn roof with a sound like a metallic shriek, and for a second, the roaring darkness was lit by a jagged, blue-purple tear of lightning. In that half-second of illumination, she saw his face. He was looking down at her, his eyes not on the hole in the roof, but on her. His expression was not one of fear or even anger. It was one of stark, stunned recognition. The darkness slammed back down. She felt him move, just slightly. The rough, calloused back of his hand, the one that knew rifles and reins, brushed her cheek. It was a gesture so tentative, so contrary to the violence of the storm, that it broke her breath. The skin on his knuckles was chapped and hard. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. Instead, she turned her head, just an inch, and leaned into the touch. It was an answer, a surrender, a silent admission that she was tired of fighting alone. She felt his breath stop, and then his other hand, the big, solid one, came up. It cupped the back of her head. his fingers tangling in her rain-dampened hair. He drew her closer. The kiss was not gentle. It was not like the first drops of rain, as she had imagined. It was like the storm itself. It was necessary. It was chapped lips and dust and the first taste of life after weeks of starvation. It was a question and an answer all at once, a desperate, mutual claiming. Marin's hands, which had been clenched into fists at her sides, flew open. She grabbed the front of his wool duster, her fingers twisting in the thick, damp material, pulling him closer, anchoring herself. His arm, which had been braced against the wall beside her head, moved, wrapping around her waist, crushing the air from her. He lifted her slightly, pulling her from the hay and into him, until her back was pressed against the solid oak of the stall. And he was the only thing holding her up. A shiver, hot and sharp, ran down her spine. It was not from cold. It was from the shock of the contact, the raw, undeniable fact of him. His mouth was warm in the freezing, dusty air. She could feel the hard muscles of his chest, the solid wall of his shoulders. They were breathing the same air. His exhalations hers, hers his, a rhythm that was separate from the howling of the wind. He was not the curse. He was the sanctuary. He held her, his grip tight, possessive, yet reverent. He held her as if she were the last piece of solid ground in a flood. He was a man of solitude, and this sudden, explosive connection was a language he had forgotten he knew. Slowly, as if coming up for air, he eased the pressure. He didn't release her, but his mouth left hers. He rested his forehead against hers, and they stayed that way, breathing hard, their eyes closed. The storm roared, but it was outside. In here, in this small, dark space, there was only the smell of hay and the sound of two hearts, beating fast, but in unison. They sank down onto a pile of old, folded saddle blankets, a nest of worn leather and wool. He kept his arm around her. "After this," he whispered, his voice a low vibration she felt in her chest. "After the storm, we stop running." She looked up, though she could only see the outline of his face in the absolute dark. "We stop running," she agreed. Her voice was steady. It was an oath. And then, a new sound. A sound that was not the wind. A tremendous crash from the front of the barn as the main door, the one they had barred, splintered and burst inward. "Check every stall." The voice was Hollister's, raw and angry, barely audible over the wind. But it was inside. Nolan moved. He was no longer a man. He was a shadow. He pulled Marin down, flat onto the blankets, and threw a heavy, oil-stiff canvas tarp over them, before sliding in beside her. They were buried in the dark, in the smell of canvas and dust. A beam from a bullseye lantern cut through the darkness. It was a yellow, smoky cone, illuminating the chaos of the barn. Dust danced in the beam like a million frantic insects. "It's a tomb in here," a man shouted. "They're here," Hollister snarled. "I know it. Check the loft." They heard footsteps, the jingle of spurs. They heard the horses in the other stalls kicking and screaming in terror. The light beam swept the floor. It passed over their hiding place, illuminating the edge of the canvas. Marin's heart stopped. She was pressed so tightly against Nolan she could feel the buckle of his belt, the hard grip of his hand on the pistol he had drawn. She held her own breath, her face buried in the rough wool of his duster. "Nothing," the voice from the loft yelled down. "It's empty. They must be in the cabin." The beam of light moved away. "Fine." Hollister's voice was a promise of violence. "Let them stay there. Let the storm pin them. When this breaks, we'll pick them up like drowned rats. Nobody moves. Wait for the sky to clear." The light disappeared. They heard the men's footsteps retreating, the sound of the horses being pulled back out of the ruined doorway. They were alone again. They didn't move for an hour. They lay under the canvas, listening to the storm slowly, agonizingly, tear itself apart. The roaring faded to a scream, then a moan, then a whistle, and then, finally, to a profound, ringing silence. The storm was over. Nolan pushed the canvas off. The air was icy cold. but clean. The dust was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic smell of ozone and the dampness of the earth. 2 people had been pulled into the barn. 2 different people emerged from beneath the canvas. They were no longer a rancher and a clerk. They were not strangers. They had looked into the heart of the storm and, instead of running, had chosen to hold on to each other. Nolan stood first. He looked down at her, his face unreadable in the pre-dawn gloom. He offered his hand. Marin took it. His grip was warm, and it was no longer a rescue. It was a partnership. He pulled her to her feet. They stood, exhausted, covered in hay and dust. In the wreckage of the barn, a faint, pale pink light began to seep through the hole in the roof. It was dawn, and with the light came a sound. Not the wind, not a man. It was a high, clear, whistling neigh. Nolan moved to a crack in the wall, and Marin stood beside him. They looked out. On the far ridge, the one that had been invisible in the dust, stood the roan stallion, Ghost Wind. He was silhouetted against the fragile pink sky, his mane and tail lifting in the clean, new breeze. He reared, his hooves punching the air, and called out again. It was not a sound of fear. It was a declaration, a wild, defiant, beautiful sound, like an amen to the promise they had made in the dark. The day of the Saguaro Spurline inauguration dawned bright and cold, the sky washed clean by the storm, as if the land itself were taking a sharp, deep breath. But the land was not clean. A raw red wound had been cut across the Saguaro Valley, and at its mouth stood a newly built platform of raw, yellow pine. Juniper Crossing was in the grip of a forced carnival. Red, white, and blue bunting was draped over doorways, but it fluttered against windows still boarded up from the storm. A brass band, imported from Santa Fe, played a tune that was aggressively cheerful and painfully off-key. The air smelled of sawdust, new paint, and the free whiskey already being poured, which did little to mask the underlying scent of fear. Silas Crane had arrived. His private train, a locomotive painted a deep, arrogant black with Crane Western rail and gleaming gold leaf, sat hissing on the new tracks. He stood on the platform, a thick, broadcloth-suited spider in the center of a new web. He was smiling, shaking hands with Deacon Voss, who looked pale and sweaty, Pike Hollister and his men, their faces grim and bruised from the storm, were not celebrating. They were a perimeter, their eyes scanning the crowd, their hands on their holsters. They were hunting. High above the street, perched on the flat roof of the feed and grain warehouse, Nolan Prescott lay still. He was a piece of the shadow. The Winchester was warm in his hands. He had a clear view of the platform, of Crane, and of the new sign hanging above it, painted in bold letters, Prosperity. He tracked Hollister's movements, his jaw tight. He was waiting. In the crowd, a woman moved with a heavy basket on her arm. She wore a simple calico dress, a faded apron, and a deep slatted sunbonnet that hid her face completely. She was Marin Ashby, and she smelled of cinnamon and baked apples. She was invisible, just another townswoman trying to sell pies to the revelers. She kept her head down, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. In her apron pocket, beneath the pies, was a folded sheaf of paper. It was the copy of her ledger, the one she had made with charcoal and oil, the one that looked just like a speech, near the town's small, stone jail. Deputy Wren Mallory stood at attention, her face impassive. She was supposed to be watching the crowd, but her gaze kept flickering to the 2 men in the single cell. They were the Miller brothers, the ranchers whose hay barn Hollister had burned as a distraction. They had been arrested that morning for public disturbance when they tried to shout the truth at Deacon Voss. They sat on a cot, their faces swollen, defeated. Wren looked at the platform. She looked at the cell. She heard the tinny music, and she made her decision. With a casualness that was its own camouflage, she turned, walked inside the office, and took the heavy ring of keys from the hook. No one was watching. She walked to the cell. The brothers looked up, expecting more abuse. She unlocked the door. The sound of the latch sliding back was loud in the small room. "Get out," she said, her voice a low monotone. Through the back. Don't run. Walk. Go to Doc Mott's. Stay there." The older brother stared, uncomprehending. "What?" "Go." She shoved him, and the urgency in her grip finally broke through their stupor. They fled out the back door, and Wren Mallory returned to her post, her face a mask of stone, her heart hammering. On the platform, the music stopped. Deacon Voss stepped up to the lectern, mopped his brow, and introduced the town's savior. Silas Crane spread his arms, basking in the thin applause. "Friends, citizens, pioneers." His voice was a rich, practiced boom, designed to sway senates and stockholders. "They say the desert cannot be tamed. They say this land is fit only for the savage and the scorpion." Marin moved. She slipped through the crowd, her basket raised. Nolan saw her. His breath caught. He slid the rifle forward, his finger resting on the trigger guard. "But we," Crane continued, "bring the iron artery of civilization. We bring progress. We bring—" "Mr. Crane." Crane stopped, annoyed at the interruption. The woman in the bonnet was at the steps of the platform, holding up a perfect, golden-crusted pie. "Mr. Crane, sir, we, the women of the Juniper Auxiliary, we bake this for you, to welcome you." Marin's voice was high, reedy, and trembling. Crane's irritation melted into a condescending smile. He loved adulation. "Why, thank you, my dear." Hollister started to move toward her. His eyes narrowed, but Crane waved him back. "It's quite all right. Pike, just a grateful citizen." Marin climbed the 3 steps. Her hand was shaking. She set the pie on the corner of the lectern. Crane's speech, a thick stack of pristine white paper, was sitting right next to it. "God bless you, Mr. Crane," she whispered, in one smooth, desperate motion. Her hands, which had mended tackle and loaded rifles, moved. She set the pie down, and as she drew her hands back, she slid his speech off the lectern and into her empty basket. Simultaneously, she slipped her own folded, charcoal-smudged copy from her apron pocket and placed it where the speech had been. It took 1 second. Thank you, my good woman," Crane said, already turning back to the crowd. Marin scurried off the platform, melting back into the sea of people, her bonnet still hiding her face. Nolan let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. His hands were slick with sweat. Crane beamed, adjusted his spectacles, and lifted the papers. "Now, as I was saying—" He looked down. He frowned. The paper was rough, not his usual bond. The writing was a neat, coded script. He cleared his throat, confused. He thought it was a joke, perhaps. "Ah," he said. Let me read to you. The list of our partners in this great enterprise." He read the first line, his voice still booming. "Judge Matheson, $500. Saguaro Valley ruling." A confused silence fell over the crowd. Crane paled. He shuffled the page. The next page was the same. "Deacon Voss," he read, his voice now a strained, high-pitched squeak. "Land assessor, false survey, Double T Ranch." In the front row, a man named Henderson, who owned the Double T, yelled, "What did he say? What about my ranch, Crane?" His face turning a mottled purple. Threw the papers down. "This is a lie, a slander." "A fabrication." From the edge of the crowd, a voice, clear and strong, cut through the air. "Is it?" Marin Ashby pulled the bonnet from her head. Her sun-streaked hair was uncovered, and her eyes were blazing. "Is it a lie, Mr. Crane? Or is it just your accounting?" A collective gasp went up. It was the clerk, the one Hollister was hunting. Deacon Voss, his face the color of ash, shrieked. "Caesar! That's the one, Caesar! She's a thief!" Pike Hollister didn't need the order. He lunged, moving with a predator's speed. Shoving people aside, he grabbed Marin's arm in a bone-crushing grip. "You're done, clerk." He drew his pistol, not to shoot her, but to clear a path. But before he could move, another voice cut in, sharp as a razor. "Let her go! Pike!" Wren Mallory had stepped into the open. Her pistol was drawn, and it was not pointed at Hollister. It was pointed, steady as a rock, at Deacon Voss. "Wren, what are you doing?" Voss stammered. "No one," Wren said, her voice ringing out for the entire town to hear, "is arresting anyone today, except maybe you, Deacon, for land theft." The town's law had just declared war on itself. Hollister laughed. A low, ugly sound. "The deputies got sand. Doesn't matter." He jerked Marin's arm, raising his pistol to club her. "She's still—" Crack. The sound was not a boom. It was a single, sharp, definitive punctuation mark from the sky. Hollister's pistol exploded in his hand. It vanished in a spray of wood and metal splinters. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure pain, and stumbled back, clutching his hand, which was now a bloody ruin. A stunned, absolute silence fell. Every eye went from Hollister's hand to the sign above the platform. The bullet, Nolan's bullet, had passed through the pistol and buried itself dead center in the word prosperity. Into that perfect, terrible silence, a new sound began. From the second-story window of the Gold Spur Saloon, Lark Monroe, her face painted for a show, began to throw the second copy of the ledger, page by page. "He said he'd bring civilization," she cried out. "Here it is." The white pages, caught by the clean wind, tumbled down. They did not fall. They flew. They scattered over the crowd like a flock of white, frantic birds, landing on the hats and shoulders of the very ranchers whose lives were detailed on them. A man grabbed a sheet. He read. He yelled. Another man read. He cursed. The silence broke. It shattered into a single, unified roar of rage. Crane, his face a mask of pure, murderous fury, saw his empire crumbling. He pointed, not at Marin, but at the crowd. "Fools, my guards fire on them. Show them what progress is." His private railroad guards, panicked by the mob, raised their rifles. They fired. Not at anyone, but over their heads. The air exploded, gun smoke, screams, and confetti. The engineer on the train, terrified, pulled the whistle, and its high, deafening shriek added to the madness. The crowd surged, not in fear, but in anger, pushing toward the platform. Nolan was already down, sliding from the roof, landing in the alley. He ran into the chaos, a solid, immovable object. He saw Marin, separated from Hollister, being grabbed by two of Crane's guards. Nolan did not shoot. He was surrounded by civilians. He used the rifle as a quarterstaff. He met the first guard with a blur of motion, the steel barrel catching the man under the chin, lifting him off his feet. The second man turned, drawing a pistol. Nolan's boot crashed into his knee, and the man folded with a wet snap. A third man, one of Hollister's, came at Marin from behind, his knife out. Marin, whose hands were so full of paper and pies, had her own blade. She spun, dropping low, and her small skinning knife flashed, cutting a deep, red line across the man's forearm. He howled, dropping the knife. Nolan grabbed her hand. "The trestle, go!" They ran, pushing through the screaming, fighting chaos. They scrambled down the raw, muddy embankment under the new platform, slipping on the loose dirt. They plunged into the darkness under the trestle bridge. It was quiet here. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and the sharp, chemical tang of fresh-cut pine and creosote. Above them, the world was ending. They could hear the thunder of boots on the planks, the screams, the pop of pistols, and the unrelenting, shrieking whistle of the train. Marin leaned against a piling, her breath tearing in and out of her lungs. She looked at her hands in the dim, filtered light. One hand was black, smeared with the charcoal ink of her ledger. The other hand was red, sticky. The blood of the man she had cut was dripping from her fingertips. She had done it. She had written the truth, and she had drawn blood. She began to tremble. It was a deep, violent tremor that started in her stomach and shook her entire body. She looked at Nolan, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a new, raw horror. She had wanted justice, but this was something else. This was the ragged, bloody line between a clerk and a killer, and she had just jumped across it. They stayed under the trestle until the sounds of chaos were replaced by the sounds of organization. They heard the sharp, military-like commands from Crane's men, rounding up the injured, silencing the dissenters. The town had been cowed. The rage had been met with overwhelming force, and it had collapsed. They slipped away in the twilight, moving like shadows, taking the long, high path back to Pronghorn Flats. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the scuff of their boots on the gravel and the ragged, shallow breaths of Maren. When they reached the cabin, she went straight to the water pump. Nolan watched as she plunged her hands into the trough, the water icy from the well. She scrubbed, her knuckles raw. She was trying to wash off the ink and the blood. She scrubbed until her skin was red, but her gaze was distant, fixed on the memory of the man's face, the flash of her own knife. "Maren," Nolan said, his voice quiet. She stopped, her hands dripping. "I cut him. Nolan, I liked it. For a second, I liked the fear in his eyes." He walked to her, took a rough burlap towel from the line, and gently took her hands. He dried them, his movements methodical. "You did what you had to do to live. That's the only law out here." "Is it?" she whispered. "It feels like I just became them." "No," he said, his grip on her hands tightening. "They draw blood for profit. You drew it for your life. It's not the same." The news came 2 days later, carried by Lark Monroe, who rode out on a borrowed mule, her face pale beneath her rouge. She was terrified, her hands shaking. "He's done it," she whispered, huddling in the cabin, the door barred. "Silas Crane. He's posted a bounty, $1,000 in gold for your return, $500 for your body." Maren felt the air leave the room. This was no longer about a ledger. It was a hunt. "And Hollister," Lark continued, her voice breaking. "His hand is ruined. Doc Mott said he'll never use his pistol with it again. He was in the saloon, drunk. He swore an oath on his ruined hand. He said he'd bring you back. Maren, he said dead or alive, but he was polishing a rope. He said alive is more fun." After Lark left, a terrible, heavy silence filled the cabin. The what-if had been replaced by when. Nolan stood at the window, staring out at the land, his back a rigid wall of stone. He had been like this for an hour, a statue of quiet, simmering anger. "He won't touch you," he said, but the words were hollow. "Nolan," Maren said, her voice soft. She came to stand beside him. The air around him was cold. "You don't understand," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "This place, I told you it was cursed. I lied. It wasn't just a flood." He turned, and his face was a mask of old, perfectly preserved grief. The man she had seen, so solid and sure, was gone, replaced by a ghost. "Eliza, she wasn't just caught. We were fighting. The water was rising, and she wanted to move the herd. It was 24 head, not worth the risk. I told her that." His voice broke, a sound like dry wood splitting. "I forbade her. I stood on the bank, and I told her if she rode into that water, she was a fool, and I wouldn't follow. Nolan, you couldn't have known." "She called me a coward," he interrupted, his eyes locking on hers, forcing her to see the ugly truth. "She said I was afraid, that I was weak, and she was right. I was afraid of losing the cattle. So she quirted her horse, and she rode into the flood, just to spite me, to prove she was stronger. And Maren, I stood there, I stood on the bank, and I watched her go. I watched the water take her. I didn't go in, I just stood there. I let her die." The confession hung in the air, heavier and more toxic than the dust storm. This was his shadow, not grief, guilt, the suffocating, paralyzing guilt of the survivor. Maren looked at the man in front of her, shattered by a choice made years ago. She saw the wound he had protected, the bad luck he used as a shield. She stepped closer. He flinched, as if expecting her to run from his contagion. She didn't run. She raised her hands, the hands he had just dried, and placed them on either side of his face. His skin was rough with stubble, his jaw tight. She held him, forcing his gaze to stay on hers. "You didn't kill her, Nolan Prescott," she said, her voice a low, fierce vow. "I let her. You did not kill her," she repeated, her thumbs brushing the tense lines at the corners of his eyes. "The flood killed her. Her own pride killed her. You're right, she was a fool. But you didn't kill her. You just had to live with it. You're not a curse. You're a man who blames himself for the rain. That's not a curse. It's just human." He didn't move, but she felt a single, hot tear fall from his eye onto her hand. The granite was cracking. "The greed of those men," she whispered, her own anger rising. "The ones who push people onto bad land, who steal the water rights, who make every day a fight. They killed her. They make us all desperate, just like they killed my father. You are not the killer. Nolan, you are the witness." He closed his eyes, his large hands coming up to cover hers, pressing her palms against his face. He leaned into her, a great, heavy weight finally setting its burden down, in that moment of complete, raw, and broken trust. She knew what she had to do. She stepped back, her resolve forged anew. He had shared his final secret. Now she would share hers. "They won't win," she said. She went to the loose floorboard by the door, pried it up, and pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped ledger. "He thinks this is just about money," she said, her hands unwrapping the book. "He thinks if he kills me, the proof is gone." She took her small knife and carefully, precisely, slid it under the glued end paper on the inside of the leather cover. She worked at it, peeling back the thick, decorative paper. "I found this in Crane's private safe the night I ran," she said. A thin, folded document was nestled against the binding. She pulled it free. She unfolded it. It wasn't a ledger. It was a map. The original territorial survey of the Saguaro Valley. "This is the map they all said was lost," she said. "The one that proves the Miller place and a dozen others are outside the railroad grant." She pointed to a second, smaller document that had been folded with it. "And this is the deed transferring that abandoned land to a holding company owned by Crane. It's dated 2 weeks before the land was officially seized." She traced the bottom line with her finger. "And here, the signature, the territorial seal, authorizing the transfer. It's Deacon Voss's. It's a forgery, a bad one. I can prove it. This was the key. This was not just bribery. This was high treason against the territory. This was the noose that would hang them all." As if summoned by the revelation, a frantic pounding came at the door. Nolan had the Winchester in his hands before the second knock. "Who is it? Wren!" The voice was breathless. Panicked, Nolan threw the bar. Deputy Wren Mallory stumbled in, her face streaked with sweat, her duster covered in mud. She had ridden hard. "You have to get out," she gasped, not even looking at Marin, her eyes on Nolan. "Both of you, now!" "What is it?" Nolan demanded. "It's Crane. He's insane. The town it's under martial law." "His men are everywhere, but he's not sending Hollister." She took a ragged breath. "He's sending the railroad crew, his demolition team. They're on the trail right now. Nolan, they're bringing dynamite." The word hung in the air, colder than any bullet. Dynamite. They weren't coming to arrest them. They weren't coming to siege. They were coming to erase Pronghorn Flats from the map. Wren was already backing out the door. "I've done what I can. I've sent word to the federal marshal in Santa Fe, but that's 3 days. You have hours. God help you." She was gone, her horse's hooves pounding the dirt, fading into the night. The silence that returned was absolute. Nolan turned to Marin. His face was no longer grieving, no longer guilty. It was clear. "Go, pack your things. Just the book. We can be in the canyons by the time they get here. Ride south. We can make Mexico." He was offering her an escape. He was offering her his life, a life on the run. Marin looked at the ledger in her hand. She looked at the cabin, this small box of wood that had become her sanctuary. She looked at the man who had just offered to abandon his entire world for her. She thought of the woman eating scraps in the diner. Slowly, she walked to the table and set the ledger down. "No," she said. "Marin," he pleaded. "This isn't a fight. This is an avalanche. We can't—" "You," she said, her voice quiet, but it cut through his. "I've been running all my life. I ran from my father's grave. I ran from Santa Fe. I ran from that diner. I am done running." She turned to face him, her eyes as clear and hard as the desert sky. "This is our home. They're bringing dynamite. Then they'll have to use it." Nolan looked at her, at the iron in her spine, and the last of his own shadows burned away. He had been protecting a ghost. She was protecting a future. He nodded, a slow, grim smile touching his lips. "All right, let's get to work. We'll call it the Juniper Defense." The rest of the night was a blur of frantic, silent preparation. They were not building a fortress. They were setting a trap. They dug shallow trenches behind the low stone walls of the corral. They filled grain sacks with dirt, stacking them in the windows of the cabin. They restrung the cowbell alarms, not just on one trail, but on all 3 approaches. They set ladders against the barn roof and escape routes into the dark arroyos. As the first, faint, gray light of dawn touched the sky, Marin sat at the table. She was writing. "What's that?" Nolan asked, checking the action on his Winchester. "A letter, for Lark." Marin said. She folded it, sealed it with a drip of wax. "It tells her where the real book is. It tells her that if we fall, she is to get that book to Doc Mott, and he is to get it to the federal court. They can kill us, Nolan, but they can't kill the truth." She stood up. The work was done. They walked onto the porch, side by side. The air was cold, still. The high desert was holding its breath. The insects were a low, electric hum, the sound of the land itself. They stood, watching the east, where the sun and their enemies would soon rise. Nolan didn't look at her. He just held out his hand. Marin looked at his scarred, calloused palm. She placed her own hand in it. His fingers closed around hers, a grip that was not about romance, but about solidarity. It was a soldier's grip, under the last of the stars. They stood as one, listening to the buzzing of the insects, a silent oath sworn to the land they were about to defend. The light came first, a cold, gray smear in the east. It was not a sunrise. It was an illumination of the enemy. They were on the ridges, not a dozen men, but closer to 30. Pike Hollister was in the lead, his black coat a stark silhouette. His left hand was a thick, white-bandaged club. He did not sit his horse like a cowboy. He sat it like a warlord. Beside him were men who did not carry rifles with the ease of ranchers. They carried heavy canvas bags, picks, and dark, coiled snakes of fuse. Nolan and Marin watched from the sandbagged cabin window. "The demolition crew," Nolan said, his voice flat. The words hung in the cold air, heavier than any bullet. Hollister raised his good hand. He did not point to the cabin. He pointed to the barn, the corrals, the well. 2 men dismounted, uncoiled a long fuse, and began to run it toward the foundation of the main barn, where Nolan kept his feed and his horses. They were not here to fight. They were here to erase. "They're not trying to drive us out," Nolan said, his voice a low, cold rumble. "They're going to bury us." He settled the Winchester against the sandbag. He was not aiming at the men. He was aiming at the thin black line they were unspooling in the dirt, 100 yards away. He let out half a breath. His world narrowed to the front sight of his rifle and that black string. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was a flat, sharp crack in the dawn. It sounded small, almost polite, far out. The black fuse line jumped, a puff of dust exploding where it lay. When the dust settled, the line was severed, cut clean in 2. A moment of stunned silence, and then Hollister roared, "Firepin them, move!" The ridges exploded. A hailstorm of lead thudded into the log walls of the cabin, punching through the windows, whining off the stones of the chimney. Nolan and Marin ducked. "They're pinned," Nolan said, reloading. "But so are we. Suddenly, a new sound, a different, sharper crackle of gunfire. It was not aimed at the cabin. It was aimed at the men on the ridges. Puffs of dust kicked up around Hollister's reserve force. One of his men yelled, spinning, clutching his shoulder. Nolan peered over the sandbag. The irrigation ditch, east. A half-mile away, in the deep, dry arroyo, a glint of metal. It was Wren Mallory. She was not alone. She had the Miller brothers, Old Man Henderson, and 2 other ranchers whose land had been stolen. They were not an army. They were 5 rifles, but they were shooting from the enemy's back. Hollister was trapped in a crossfire. "Nolan!" Marin yelled from the other side of the cabin. She was up on a stool, peering through a small hole in the chinking, her hand gripping the small, cracked-looking glass. She had a clear view of the ditch. "They're sending 3 men to flank the ditch. They're moving left." She covered the mirror, then flashed a single, sharp beam of sunlight toward the arroyo. "Move left, in the ditch." Wren saw the signal. She fired twice, and the Miller brothers shifted, moving down the ditch, meeting the 3 men in a short, brutal exchange. Marin was no longer a clerk. She was a field general. She watched the entire battle unfold, her face a mask of cold, absolute concentration. She saw a second group of Hollister's men break for the horses. She flashed the mirror twice. Fast, retreat, danger. Back in Juniper Crossing, Lark Monroe, who had been watching the ridges with a spyglass, saw the 2 flashes. It was her signal. She ran from the saloon, her red dress dragging in the mud, and sprinted to the small, stone church. She grabbed the thick, heavy bell rope. With all her weight, she pulled. A deep, resonant bong rolled across the high desert. It was not a call to prayer. It was a fire alarm, a call to arms. Doc Mott, hearing the bell, wheeled a heavy operating table out onto his porch. He laid out bandages, whiskey, and carbolic acid. He put on his butcher's apron. The town was no longer waiting. It was preparing. The bell and the shots from the ditch drove Hollister into a cold fury. He was being made a fool of. He looked at the cabin, his eyes black with hate. He wanted the woman. He saw his chance. Nolan was pinned, firing toward the ridge. Wren was busy with the flanking team. Hollister slid from his horse, unseen, and began to crawl, using a shallow gully, toward the back of the cabin. Marin was tracking the men on the ridge when she heard it. Not a gunshot, a scraping, a boot on the stone step at the back door. She spun, her Winchester empty. Nolan had the other one. The back door, weakened by the storm, exploded inward. Pike Hollister filled the doorway. His face was a mask of sweat, dust, and rage. His ruined hand was a club at his side. His good hand held a long, gleaming skinning knife. "The girl," he hissed, his eyes feeding on her. "I told you I'd come back." He lunged. Marin had no time. She couldn't reach the rifle. Her hand, scrambling, grabbed the one thing on the peg by the door. Nolan's coiled lariat. It was not a weapon. It was a rope, but she was desperate. As he came at her, she swung the entire, heavy coil, not like a rope, but like a mace. The hard, knotted end caught him across the face with a wet, heavy thwack. He roared in pain, stumbling back, but it only made him madder. He lunged again, swiping with the knife. Marin fell back over the table, scattering tin plates. He was on her, grabbing her hair, raising the knife. Marin screamed and shoved her left arm up, the arm that still clutched the heavy, empty rifle she had been reloading. The knife came down. The razor edge sliced deep into her forearm. A line of fire, but the blade, aimed for her heart, struck the solid steel barrel of the Winchester. The knife twisted, stuck. That 1 second was all Nolan needed. He had heard the crash. He burst in from the main room. He saw Hollister. He saw the knife. He saw the blood blooming on Marin's sleeve. A sound, not human, tore from Nolan's throat. He did not shoot. He was too close. He dropped his rifle and hit Hollister with 200 pounds of solid muscle. He was a force of nature, a stampeding bull. The blow sent Hollister flying backward, crashing through the ruined door and into the yard. Nolan was on him. This was not a fight. It was a reckoning. It was knees and elbows and fists that felt like stones. The dust rose around them, a choking cloud. Nolan's training, his strength, his cold rage, it was too much. Hollister, one-handed and surprised, was outmatched. Nolan got him on his back, his large hands closing around Hollister's throat. He squeezed. Hollister's face turned purple. "Nolan!" Marin was in the doorway, her arm wrapped in a bloody rag, her eyes wide. Nolan looked at her. He looked at the man choking beneath him. He saw Eliza's face, drowning in the flood. He saw the line. He let go, with a gasp. Hollister sucked in air. Nolan didn't give him a chance to recover. He grabbed the lariat from the doorway, and with a series of brutal, efficient movements, he hogtied Hollister, his hands and feet bound tight. "He's for Wren," Nolan panted, his chest heaving. "He's for the law." "Splendid," a voice said, dripping with sarcasm. Silas Crane was walking into the yard. He was flanked by two men in dark suits, carrying new, gleaming repeating rifles. Snipers. Crane looked at the trussed-up Hollister, at Nolan, and at Marin, bleeding. His plan was in ruins. His face was pale with a furious, reptilian rage. "You have all cost me a great deal of trouble," Crane said. He looked past them, at the small, stone shed where Nolan kept his blasting powder for clearing rock. "I think it's time to liquidate my assets." He pulled a small, coiled fuse from his pocket. He snapped his fingers. One of his guards produced a lucifer match, struck it, and lit the fuse. Crane walked calmly toward the powder shed. "Nolan!" Marin screamed. Nolan was too far away. He raised his rifle, but the two snipers leveled theirs at him. He was pinned. "No!" Marin yelled. She was not running, not again. She ran, but not away. She ran at Crane. He was just about to shove the sputtering, 5-second fuse into the latch of the powder shed. Marin hit him from the side, but she didn't grab him. Her eyes were on the fuse. She grabbed the sizzling, sparking thing with her bare hand. The fuse was white-hot. It seared her palm instantly, the smell of burnt flesh rising in the air. She cried out, a high, thin sound of pure agony, but her fingers did not unclench. She ripped the fuse away, stumbling, and threw it into the dirt, where it burned out. Her hand was ruined, but the shed was safe. Crane, enraged, raised his hand to strike her. And then, the world dissolved into chaos. Jingle, jingle, jang, bong, the cowbells, the tripwires. They were all going off at once, but not from the ridge. From the west, a low, rolling thunder. Nolan looked up. His eyes went wide. Ghost wind. He breathed, a sea of horseflesh. The entire wild herd, panicked by the ringing church bell and the gunfire, was stampeding. They had taken the wrong arroyo, the one Nolan had wired. They burst through the rotted corral fence like it was paper. The yard was filled with screaming, wild horses. Crane's snipers were scattered, terrified. The horses were everywhere, a living, moving, bucking wall. Nolan saw it. The chaos was a screen. He put 2 fingers to his mouth and blew a sharp, 3-note whistle. His own horses, trapped in the wrecked barn, heard the call. They burst out, joining the stampede, adding to the madness. The air was thick with dust and hair and the sound of 1,000 hooves. And into that chaos, the townsfolk came, led by Doc Mott, who was holding a shotgun, and the Miller brothers, armed with pitchforks. The people of Juniper Crossing surged into the yard. They had heard the bell. They had seen the fire. They had seen Wren's fight. They were done being afraid. The balance tipped. It was no longer a siege. It was a rout. Crane's men, outnumbered by ranchers and horses, threw down their guns. The 2 snipers were dragged from their feet. Silas Crane stood alone in the center of the yard, his suit covered in dust. He was surrounded. The wind from the stampede and the downdraft from the running crowd kicked up the last of the evidence, the papers that had been scattered from the platform days before. They flew, swirling in the air around Crane's head. He was captured, kneeling in the dirt, as the proof of his crimes rained down on him like snow. Justice in the high territories doesn't arrive in a velvet box. It arrives on a tired horse. 3 days late, smelling of dust and federal authority. The circuit judge, a man named Elias Thorne, didn't use the church. He commandeered the feed and grain warehouse, the same one Nolan had used as a sniper's perch. He had the platform cleared, a simple pine table and chair set up, and the doors open to the wind. The whole of Juniper Crossing stood in the dusty, sun-slatted air, smelling burlap and old corn. Doc Mott was the first witness. He produced his copy of the ledger, the one that had been hidden in his anatomy book. "It was brought to me," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet, "by Nolan Prescott at 2 a.m, 3 days before the depot fire. Lark Monroe was next. She was terrified, her hands visibly shaking, but her voice was clear. She identified the second copy, the one she had pulled, singed and water-damaged, from the piano after the riot. Marin gave it to me. She told me to keep it safe, and I did. Then, Marin. Her left arm was in a clean sling. Her right hand was a club of thick, white bandages, the burns from the fuse still raw. She looked small, exhausted, and unbroken. She held up the original ledger, the one from the floorboard. "Your Honor," she said, her voice quiet but not weak. "Silas Crane is a man of meticulous records, but he is also a man of vanity." She pointed to the forged deed, the one bearing Deacon Voss's fake signature. He used a standard formulation of iron gall ink, but for his own private ledger, his real one, he used a custom blend. It's darker. It has a base of walnut oil. She laid a clean white sheet of paper down. She took a pen, dipped it in the judge's inkwell, and made a mark. Then she pointed to her ledger. "His ink doesn't bleed. Mine does. His forgery. It bleeds." The case was over in an hour. Deacon Voss was the first to fall. Judge Thorne looked at him, his face carved from granite. "Mr. Voss, you were entrusted with the law. You used it as a bludgeon. You are stripped of your office and your honor." He unpinned the tin star from Voss's chest. Voss, a blubbering, gray-faced man, was cuffed. The judge looked over the crowd, his eyes landing on the tall, stoic deputy by the door. "Deputy Mallory." Wren stepped forward, her face impassive. "This town," the judge said, "needs a lawman. It appears to me it already has one." He did not pin the star on her. He handed it to her. Wren looked at the cheap piece of tin in her palm. A single, difficult tear cut a clean line through the dust on her cheek. She did not cry. She took a deep, shuddering breath, wiped the tear away with her knuckle, and pinned the badge to her own duster. It looked, for the first in its history, like it was finally clean. Pike Hollister was next, dragged forward in chains, his ruined hand a grotesque, bandaged claw. 20 years, the judge said, not bothering with a speech. "Hard labor. You will help build the Central Pacific Line. Mr. Hollister, a fitting end for a railroad man." As they dragged him away, he stopped, twisting to look at Marin. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, full of a venom that was its own kind of death. "You should have kept running. Clerk, it would have been easier." Marin met his gaze. Her hand throbbed, her arm ached, but she stood straight. "I just learned how," she said, finally. Silas Crane. He stood tall, his suit immaculate. He began a speech, his voice booming again, about manifest destiny and the unfortunate cost of progress. The judge cut him off, his voice like the crack of a rifle. "Silas Crane, you mistook arson for progress and theft for destiny. You are a common thief, sir. Nothing more. You will be remanded to the federal prison at Yuma." As the marshals took his arms, Crane's mask of civility finally shattered. He looked at Nolan and Marin, standing together by the door. His face was purple with hate. "You," he hissed. "You primitives, you farmers, you've undone." And then, a sound. It started low, from the back. A single rancher, Old Man Henderson, clapping his calloused hands. Slowly. Then Doc Mott joined in. Then Lark. It was not a cheer. It was an applause. A deep, rolling, rhythmic sound of judgment. It was the sound of the land itself, rising up. Silas Crane, The man of finance and power, visibly flinched. He bowed his head as the sound washed over him. The only sound in the world. The sound of his absolute and total defeat. That night, there was no formal celebration. There was just a relief. Someone strung lanterns between the feed store and the saloon. Someone else, one of the Miller brothers, produced a guitar and began to play a soft, slow Spanish melody. Lark, her voice no longer brittle but rich and warm, began to sing. It was a spontaneous festival of survivors. Nolan stood in the shadows, a cup of coffee in his good hand. He was a man of solitude, and this was too many people. Marin found him. She was no longer wearing the tattered calico. Lark had lent her a simple, dark blue dress, with her arm in the sling and her hand bandaged. She looked like a wounded soldier, but she was smiling. She said nothing. She just stood in front of him and held up her good hand, the one that wasn't burned. Nolan looked at her hand, then at her face. He looked at the dancing, at the people. He looked like a man being asked to step into a cage of lions. "Nolan," she said softly, "it's just music." He put his coffee cup down. He took her small, uninjured hand in his massive, scarred one. He led her to the edge of the light. He was a terrible dancer. He was stiff, awkward, his boots clumsy on the packed dirt. Marin didn't care. She stepped closer, resting her head against the solid wall of his chest. She could feel his heart, a slow, steady, powerful beat beneath her ear. He put his arm around her, his large hand resting on the small of her back. It was not a grip. It was not a claim. It was a statement. It was a quiet, solid presence that said, "I am here. You are safe." They swayed to the music. Two wounded people, standing in the middle of a town they had broken and saved. When the song ended, they didn't want to go back. The light, the people. It was too much. Wordlessly, he led her away from the lanterns, across the street, to the barn. His barn. The one they had defended. It was quiet, the stalls rebuilt, the air smelling of clean hay, horse leather, and the faint, sweet scent of cured wood. Moonlight, thin and pale, fell through the repaired high window. He took off his heavy duster, the one that smelled of dust and cordite, and hung it on a peg. He turned to her. He was just a man. Not a myth, not a curse, just a man, tired and whole. He reached out, his hand hesitating. He did not touch her wounded hand. He did not touch her arm in the sling. He raised his hand, very slowly, and touched her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, a gesture of almost unbearable tenderness. Marin closed her eyes, her breath catching. She leaned into his calloused palm, a silent acceptance. He bent his head. The kiss was nothing like the desperate, storm-fueled kiss in the hay. This was slow. This was a long, deep, quiet conversation. It was a kiss of arrival. It said, "You are home." It said, "The running is done." He pulled back, his eyes dark in the moonlight. He looked at her bandaged hand, the one that had saved him. He lifted it, his touch as light as a feather, and he pressed his lips to the clean white wrapping. A kiss of reverence, a kiss of healing. A long, shuddering breath left her. She stepped into him, her good arm wrapping around his waist, and she buried her face in the rough cotton of his shirt. He held her, his arms wrapping around her, and for a long time, they just stood. They just breathed. Two people who had been fragments, becoming whole. He led her to a stall filled with fresh, clean hay and a pile of thick wool saddle blankets. He laid one out, a clean, soft bed. They sat, then lay down, not in a rush of passion, but in a wave of profound, exhausted relief. She lay with her head on his shoulder, his arm a secure, warm weight around her. Her fingers, the ones on her good hand, traced the seam of his shirt. She was listening to his heart. He felt a single, warm drop land on his shirt, then another. "Marin," he whispered. She let out a sound. It was a choked, watery thing, half a sob, half a laugh. She pushed herself up on one elbow, looking down at him. The moonlight was a silver line in her hair. and it caught the wet tracks on her cheeks. "It's just," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's just, I'm not eating anyone's leftovers, not anymore." His heart ached. He saw her, just for a second, back in the silver kettle, a proud, starving ghost. He raised his hand and tucked her hair behind her ear. "No," he said, his voice rough. "You're not, from the moment I pulled that chair." We were sitting at the same table. She cried then. A quiet, cleansing rain. A soft woof from the open stall window made them both freeze. Nolan was on his feet in an instant, but he didn't reach for a gun. He just smiled. The roan stallion, Ghostwind, had stuck his head over the rail, drawn by the light, or the smell of apples, or just by the quiet. He looked at them, his eyes bright and intelligent. Marin, her tears still wet on her face, looked at the wild, beautiful, impossible creature. She laughed. It was the first time Nolan had ever heard her laugh. It was a real, clear, beautiful sound. Nolan, his heart full, found an apple in his saddlebag and held it out. The stallion lipped it from his palm, tossed his magnificent head, and vanished, a true spirit of the prairie. Nolan turned back to Marin. She was smiling, her eyes shining in the moonlight. He bent down and kissed her again, tasting the salt of her tears, the sweetness of her laugh, and the promise of 1,000 quiet nights, just like this one. The fall came, and it was the first good fall Juniper Crossing had seen in a decade. The land, free of cranes' fences, breathed. The saguaro spur line, a red scar of greed, began to wash out in the rains, its tracks already being salvaged by ranchers to build stronger corrals. The federal marshals had returned the grazing rights, and the valley was alive with the sound of cattle, the burned-out husk of the old town sign. Prosperity was torn down. In its place, the Miller brothers, their land restored, raised a new one. It was not painted by a professional. It was carved, deep and rough, into a solid plank of pine. It said, "This land belongs to those who tend it." At Pronghorn Flats, the sound of hammering echoed across the canyon. Nolan was building. He tore down the small, mean porch and built a new one, a deep, wide veranda that ran the full length of the cabin. It was built for 2 people to sit, side by side, and watch the weather come in. In the center of it, he placed a long table, built from the same yellow pine as the town's new sign. And at the head of the table, he placed a single, unremarkable chair. It was the one he had dragged across the floor of the silver kettle. He had gone back and bought it from the proprietor for $2 silver. He had sanded it, oiled the wood until it shone, and mended the split rail. It was a sturdy, simple thing, and it was always kept empty, a permanent place setting for any lost, hungry traveler who might be passing through. Marin, her right hand scarred but healed, a pale, puckered map of the fire, found her own way to build. She did not build with wood. She built with words. She took over the abandoned land assessor's office, the one that had belonged to Deacon Voss. She whitewashed the walls, threw out the forged maps, and in the evening, she lit a dozen lamps. She started a school. The ranchers, men with hands as rough as Nolan's, would come in at dusk, their hats in their hands, their faces sheepish. She did not teach them poetry. She taught them letters. She taught them to read. And more importantly, she taught them to read contracts. She held up deeds, her bandaged hand pointing, her voice clear. "This clause," she would say, "the in perpetuity clause, this is how they steal your water. This is where you draw the line." She was arming them, not with rifles, but with ink, ensuring that no one would ever be fooled by a paper thief again. The town healed around them. Sheriff Wren Mallory, her badge now polished, rebuilt the town's force. She hired 2 young, tough men, not for their speed with a gun, but for their patience. Her one and only rule, her new oath, was protect first, arrest later. Lark Munro, tired of the smell of stale whiskey, sold her share of the saloon and opened a tea house. It was a small, clean room with a real, tuned piano, a small stage, and curtains. It was a place for poets, musicians, and travelers to rest. A small island of civilization. Doc Mott, his business booming as the town grew, hammered a new shingle over his door. It no longer read H. Mott, Surgeon. It read The Community Clinic. His fees were simple. Pay what you can. If you have no cash, a chicken or a bag of flour will do. If you have neither, a thank you will suffice. The land itself seemed to recognize the change. One bright October afternoon, Marin and Nolan rode out, not to patrol, but just to ride. They found themselves on the high ridge, the one where the wild herd ran. Ghost Wind was there. He was not a spirit, but he was magnificent. The roan stallion stood, his coat shining, and watched them. He was not afraid. Nolan reined in. He knows us now. Slowly, Marin dismounted. She held out her hand. In it, she had an apple. She walked forward. The stallion did not bolt. He watched her, his ears pricked. He took 2 steps, then another. He stretched his neck, his warm, velvet nose brushing her scarred palm. He took the apple, a single, clean crunch. He looked at her, then at Nolan. A long, intelligent gaze. He had learned to trust, but he was not tamed. With a toss of his head, he wheeled, his white tail flashing. He rejoined his herd, and they moved as one, a flowing river of horseflesh, running free into the endless, open prairie. Marin smiled, her hand still tingling from his touch. That night, they sat on the new porch, at the new table. The stars were so bright they looked like holes punched in a black, velvet sky, a shower of meteors. The Leonids was falling, and they sat, shoulder to shoulder, and watched the heavens tear and mend. Nolan's arm rested on the back of her chair. His hand, warm and calloused, was a familiar weight. He cleared his throat. I was thinking, he said, his voice a low, hesitant rumble. This fall, the cattle look good. The price is high. I was thinking, maybe, we could add another room. Onto the back, a real room, with a glass window. Marin smiled, not looking at him, just watching the stars. And what would we do with another room? Well, he said, shifting. A house. A house needs room for things, for a future. He was not a man of easy words. He was a man of barns and fences and rooms. Marin did not answer. She just lifted her hand, the one with the pale, red scars, and laid it on top of his. Her fingers laced through his. It was all the answer he needed. When Nolan Prescott pulled a chair for a stranger eating scraps, he thought he was offering a meal. He was not. He was pulling a new, unexpected, and beautiful life into the 4 lonely walls of his world. And on that high, windswept land, they learned the final, greatest truth of the desert, that love is not a cage. It is not about possession, or bridles, or ropes. It is about finding the one person who makes you feel as wild and as free as a stallion on the ridge. And then, it is about the simple, quiet, daily choice to stay, far in the distance, so faint it was almost part of the silence. A train whistle blew. It was not the shriek of the Crane Western. It was just a train, moving east, carrying people to other towns, other lives. It was no longer a threat. It was just a sound, the sound of a world moving forward, leaving behind a small town that had, against all odds, chosen justice and found grace. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video. And if you can support us by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people,